The warhounds had not been fed in 2 days when Seren Lake walked into the kennel for the first time. She could smell it before she saw it. Not the dogs themselves, though 6 warhounds in an enclosed stone building carried their own weather system of musk and heat and the particular sharp tang of predators who had not been exercised enough. What she smelled was hunger. Hunger had a scent that most people did not recognize because most people had never been close enough to a hungry animal to learn it. It was the smell of stomach acid on an empty gut, of saliva thickening because there was nothing to swallow, of the body beginning to consume itself in small, imperceptible ways that announced themselves through chemistry before they announced themselves through behavior. Her father had taught her that. Owen Lake, huntsman of Cairn Hollow, who had bred tracking hounds for the border patrols for 30 years and who had told his daughter at 7 years old that the first thing you learn about an animal is what it needs, and the second thing you learn is how it tells you. Seren stood in the kennel doorway and let her eyes adjust to the dim interior. The building was stone and timber, built into the east wall of the war compound, long and low with individual stalls along one side and an open central area with a packed earth floor. Straw bedding in the stalls, old and damp and overdue for changing. Water troughs mostly empty. Feeding bowls bone dry, 6 warhounds. She had been told about them during her assignment briefing, which had lasted approximately 40 seconds and consisted of Marshal Joran Cade pointing at the kennel building and saying that the hounds needed feeding and that the last 2 kennel workers had quit after the gray female took a piece out of one and the big male pinned the other against a wall. He had said this with the flat delivery of a man communicating facts rather than warnings. And Seren had listened with the flat attention of a woman who had been handling animals since before she could form sentences and who understood that an animal pinning a human against a wall was an animal communicating a boundary, not issuing a death threat. She stepped inside. She did not approach the hounds. She walked to the center of the open area, lowered herself to the packed earth, crossed her legs, placed her hands on her knees, and sat. The hounds were in their stalls. Most of them. The big gray male was lying in the open area near the far wall, watching her with dark brown eyes that tracked every movement with the calm, sustained attention of an animal deciding whether something was prey, threat, or furniture. He was enormous, 36 inches at the shoulder if he was standing, which he was not, because a dog that large did not need to stand to make his point. His coat was dark gray, going lighter across the chest and white around the muzzle. Scars everywhere, a long one across his shoulder, a shorter one along his jaw. The particular accumulation of damage that came from years of combat service, each mark a story written in tissue. Seren sat. She breathed. She made herself small and still and present the way her father had taught her when introducing herself to a new animal. You do not approach. You do not reach. You do not speak. You sit, and you let them come to you. Because the act of coming to you is the act of choosing, and an animal that chooses to approach has already decided that you are safe. The big male watched her for 40 minutes. She knew because she counted her breaths, and she breathed at a steady rate of 12 per minute, which meant she counted 480 breaths while the gray dog studied her from across the kennel floor. At breath 481, he stood. He was taller than she had estimated, taller and heavier and more like a wolf than any dog she had known in Cairn Hollow, where the tracking hounds were lean and rangy and built for endurance rather than force. This animal was built for force. His shoulders were dense with muscle, His paws were the size of her spread hand. His head was broad and heavy, the skull of a creature designed to bite through armor padding. He walked to her. He did not hurry. He placed each paw with deliberation, the way old dogs moved when their joints had opinions about speed. He stopped 2 paces from her. He sniffed the air. She could hear his breathing, deep and slow, the sound of lungs the size of bread loaves working through the scent profile of a new human. She stayed still. She kept her hands on her knees. She did not look directly at his eyes because direct eye contact was a challenge in animal language, and she was not here to challenge anything. She was here to sit on the floor and be evaluated, and she was content to let the evaluation take as long as it needed. The gray male closed the distance. He sniffed her knee. He sniffed her hand. He sniffed her hip, where the pouch of dried liver treats hung on her belt, and she felt his nose press against the leather with the increased intensity of an animal identifying food. She did not reach for the treats, not yet. Food was a tool, and tools used too early became bribes, and bribes built transactional relationships rather than trust. Her father had taught her that too. You feed an animal after it trusts you, not before. Otherwise, you are not a caretaker. You are a vending machine. The gray male completed his assessment. He circled her once, a full rotation, the same circuit that wolves use to evaluate a resting site before committing. Then he lay down beside her. His massive body settled against her left side, his head lowered to her thigh, and the weight of him pressed against her leg like an anchor dropping. Seren placed her hand on his head. She scratched behind his ear. She felt the tension in his body release in a wave that traveled from his skull through his shoulders and down his spine until his tail, a heavy gray rope, thumped once against the floor. She named him Stone, not because he was hard, but because he was solid, and solid things could be leaned on. The other hounds came after Stone, not all at once. The gray-brown female with the torn ear came next, approaching with the wary confidence of a pack alpha, investigating a situation that her subordinate had already approved. She was smaller than Stone, but denser, more compact, with pale amber eyes that assessed Seren with an intelligence that bordered on uncomfortable. She did not lie down. She sat beside Seren's right knee and watched her with those amber eyes for several minutes before pushing her head against Seren's free hand in a gesture that was less affection than instruction. "Pet me," the gesture said. "I have decided to allow it." Seren named her Bryn. The other 4 came over the next hour, each on its own schedule, each through its own process of approach and evaluation. She named them as they came. Rust, a red-brown male with a limp in his front, left from an old injury. Needle, a lean female with a narrow face and nervous energy. Moss, a dark male so quiet she did not notice him until he was lying behind her. Flint, the youngest, barely 2, still growing into his paws, with the clumsy enthusiasm of a warhound who had not yet learned that enthusiasm was supposed to be beneath him. 6 warhounds, 6 animals that had been unfed for 2 days, that had injured their previous handlers, that the War Council had discussed putting down as recently as last month, according to the compound gossip. 6 animals that were now lying around a small Omega woman on a kennel floor, breathing the slow, deep breaths of creatures who had decided, through the particular democratic process of pack consensus, that this person was acceptable. Seren sat with them for another hour. Then she stood, walked to the supply store, requisitioned 2 days' worth of meat rations from the cook's apprentice, carried the buckets back to the kennel, and fed them. She fed Stone first because he was oldest and because he had trusted first, and in pack dynamics, the order of feeding established the order of importance. She fed Bryn second because Bryn was the pack alpha, and feeding her second acknowledged her rank while establishing that Seren, not Bryn, controlled the food. She fed the rest in the order they had approached her, because consistency mattered more than fairness in animal hierarchy, and she wanted every hound to understand that the sequence was deliberate. They ate. They ate with the focused, efficient consumption of animals that had been hungry long enough to remember it, and Seren watched them eat and felt the first real thing she had felt since arriving at the war compound 3 weeks ago. Not happiness, exactly, purpose, the particular satisfaction of being needed by something that could not pretend because animals did not pretend. They were hungry and she had food, and the transaction was honest in a way that nothing else in this compound of soldiers and politics and war had been since she arrived. She cleaned the water troughs and filled them. She changed the straw in the stalls, hauling the old bedding to the waste pile and spreading fresh straw in thick, even layers. She checked each hound for injuries, running her hands over their bodies with the systematic attention her father used on his tracking hounds, feeling for heat, swelling, tenderness. Rust's limp was old and structural, nothing to be done. Needle had a small cut on her right forepad that needed cleaning. Stone's joints were stiff when he rose, the early signs of age in a breed that did not live long. She worked until the light changed and the compound's evening routines began around her. Soldiers moving to the mess hall, the clang of the smith's hammer falling silent, the sentries calling shift change from the walls. She worked until the kennel was clean and the hounds were fed and watered and bedded and calm. And then she sat on the floor again and let Stone put his head on her thigh and Bryn press against her knee, and the 4 others arranged themselves in the particular constellation of bodies that a pack assumes when it is safe. And she sat in the middle of 6 warhounds and breathed. On the wall above the kennel, though she did not know it then, a king was watching. Connell Breck stood at the east parapet with his arms folded across his chest and looked down at the kennel building and the small woman who had just walked in and sat on the floor as though the 6 most dangerous animals in his compound were house cats. He had been watching the kennel situation deteriorate for months. The hounds were a military asset, bred and trained at enormous expense, but they were also a liability because they could not be handled, and an unhandled warhound was a problem that grew teeth. His war council had recommended disposal. His marshal had recommended patience. His supply officer, Lord Marin, had recommended disposal with an addendum about the cost of meat rations. Connell had recommended nothing because he did not yet have enough information to form a position, and forming positions without information was how his father had died. Now he had information. A woman sat on a kennel floor with 6 warhounds around her, and the hounds were not attacking. The hounds were not growling, the hounds were lying down. The largest one had its head in her lap, and the alpha female was leaning against her knee, and the others were arranged in the resting formation that hounds used only when they felt entirely, completely safe. He watched for 20 minutes. He watched her stand, leave, return with food, and feed them in a deliberate sequence that he recognized from his own knowledge of pack dynamics, which was limited but sufficient to understand that the sequence was not random. He watched the hounds eat without aggression, without guarding, without the snarling competition that had marked every feeding he had witnessed since the last competent handler was killed in the border skirmish at Ashwick. He asked Marshal Cade who she was. Cade told him, Seren Lake, Cairn Hollow, Omega, Kennel assignment. Connell stood on the wall and watched the Omega clean the kennel with the efficient focus of someone who understood that care was work and work was care, and the two were not different things. And he felt something shift in the architecture of his attention, a small structural adjustment, like a foundation stone settling into a new position. He went to his quarters. He ate alone, as he did every night, at the desk where he wrote his correspondence and drew his maps and conducted the solitary business of ruling a kingdom at war. The food was adequate. The silence was familiar. The quarters were functional, clean, private, exactly suited to a man who had decided years ago that solitude was not loneliness but strategy. He ate, and he did not think about the omega in the kennel. He did not think about the way Stone had put his head in her lap. He did not think about the feeding sequence or the clean straw or the small scarred hands that moved over the hounds' bodies with the confident tenderness of someone who had been taught that caring for another creature was a skill, not a sentiment. He did not think about any of it. He finished his meal. He worked until midnight. He slept. In the kennel, Surin Lake slept on the floor between 6 warhounds, because the hounds had not been properly settled in years, and because the first night mattered, and because she was not willing to leave them alone until they understood that someone was going to stay. 3 weeks passed before the king came down from the wall. In those 3 weeks, the kennel transformed. Surin established a routine so consistent that Stone began meeting her at the kennel door before she arrived each morning, his tail swinging in the low, measured wag of an old dog who had learned that predictability was a form of love. She fed at dawn and dusk, the same time every day, the same sequence every feeding. She exercised the hounds in the training yard during the mid-morning lull when the soldiers were at drills and the yard was empty, running them through the basic commands their previous training had instilled and which her consistency was now reinforcing. Sit, stay, heel, return. She added her own commands. Settle, which meant lie down and remain calm regardless of stimulus. Easy, which meant reduce intensity. Watch, which meant focus attention on whatever she indicated. The hounds responded. Not immediately, not uniformly, but with the gradual compounding obedience of animals who understood that the person issuing commands was also the person who fed them and cleaned their stalls and checked their feet and spoke to them in the low, steady voice that meant everything was fine, regardless of whether everything was fine. Bryn was the fastest learner. The gray-brown alpha female had an intelligence that Surin recognized as exceptional even by warhound standards, a capacity for sustained attention and problem-solving that went beyond training into something closer to comprehension. When Surin gave a new command, Bryn learned it in 3 repetitions. When Surin changed the exercise routine, Bryn adjusted without confusion. When Surin introduced the concept of walking calmly through the compound, rather than being led on heavy chain leads, Bryn walked at her heel with the composed precision of a show dog, her torn ear swiveling to track sounds while her body remained aligned with Surin's stride. The compound noticed. Soldiers who had crossed the yard to avoid the kennel building began pausing at the fence to watch Surin work the hounds. The farrier, a quiet beta woman named Kess, who shod the cavalry horses and minded her own business with religious devotion, started leaving bone scraps outside the kennel door. The cook's apprentice, who had been terrified of the hounds since one had growled at him through the supply window 6 months ago, began asking Surin questions about the animals during her ration pickups. Tentative questions that revealed a curiosity he had been too frightened to exercise. Lord Marin noticed too, but differently. He appeared at the kennel on the 9th day, ledger in hand, and informed Surin that the meat rations allocated to the warhounds exceeded what he considered operationally justifiable. 6 animals consuming 12 pounds of raw meat per day was 72 pounds per week, which was the equivalent of feeding 8 soldiers. He had prepared a revised ration schedule that reduced the allocation by 40% and substituted grain mash for half the remaining meat. Surin listened. She stood in the kennel doorway with Stone at her side and Bryn sitting behind her left knee and listened to Lord Marin explain his numbers with the careful precision of a man who believed numbers were the highest form of truth. When he finished, she told him that warhounds were obligate carnivores with a metabolic rate 3 times that of a domestic dog. She told him that grain mash would cause digestive distress within 48 hours and systemic malnutrition within 2 weeks. She told him that a malnourished warhound was not a cheaper warhound, but a dead one, and that replacing 6 purpose-bred, combat-trained animals would cost more than the meat rations for the rest of the campaign combined. Marin's watery blue eyes narrowed. He told her that he was the supply officer and that ration allocation was his authority. Seren told him that she was the kennel handler and that the hound's nutrition was hers. The standoff lasted 7 seconds. It ended when Stone, who had been sitting quietly at Serene's hip, stood up. The gray male did not growl. He did not bare his teeth. He simply stood to his full height beside the small Omega, and the top of his head reached her shoulder, and the breadth of his chest was wider than Marin's ledger, and the quiet fact of his size in the doorway communicated something that Seren's argument had not. Marin left. The ration schedule was not revised. Serene did not realize that the king had watched the exchange from the east parapet until 2 days later, when Marshal Cade appeared at the kennel and informed her that the warhound meat rations had been locked in at current levels by the king's direct order, effective immediately, with a note that any future revisions would require the king's personal approval. Cade delivered this information with the same flat affect he delivered everything, but there was something at the corner of his mouth that might have been the ghost of satisfaction. He glanced at Stone, who was lying in the doorway chewing a femur bone, and nodded once at the dog and once at Seren and left without additional commentary. The king came down from the wall on the 22nd day. Seren was in the training yard with the hounds, running them through a new exercise she had designed. The drill was simple in concept and demanding in execution. She placed 6 bowls of meat in a line across the yard, 1 for each hound. She brought the hounds to the yard gate. She released them 1 at a time, each to its own bowl, but before they could eat, she gave the settle command, and each hound had to lie down beside its bowl and wait until she gave the release word. The exercise trained impulse control, individual discipline within a pack context, and trust that the food would still be there after the waiting. She was working with Flint, the youngest, who had the impulse control of a 2-year-old warhound, which was to say almost none. Flint had reached his bowl, started to eat, been recalled, returned to Seren, and been walked back to the bowl to try again. This was the 4th repetition. Seren's patience was the same on the 4th attempt as it had been on the 1st, because her father had taught her that frustration was a human emotion that animals read as inconsistency, and inconsistency undid training faster than anything except cruelty. She was resettling Flint beside his bowl when she became aware of someone standing at the yard fence. She did not look up immediately. Her attention was on Flint, whose ears were forward and whose body was vibrating with the effort of remaining in the settle position while raw meat sat 6 inches from his nose. She held the settle for 5 seconds, 10, 15. Flint's haunches trembled, his nostrils flared, but he held. She gave the release. Flint lunged for the bowl and ate with the full body enthusiasm of a young dog who had just accomplished something extraordinary and was being rewarded for it. Serene gave him a liver treat on top of the meal because the best rewards came on top of what was already good, reinforcing the association between patience and abundance. Then she looked at the fence. The king was leaning against the top rail with his forearms crossed over the wood. He was wearing campaign leathers, no coat, sleeves pushed past his elbows. His dark brown hair was pushed back from his forehead in the careless way she had observed from across the compound, and the scar along his left temple caught the mid-morning light in a thin white line. His gray-green eyes were watching the hounds with an expression she could not immediately read, which was unusual for her because she was better at reading faces than most people, animal and human alike. She met his eyes. She held the contact for a beat, which was longer than protocol allowed between an Omega and the Alpha King, but Seren had spent 3 weeks maintaining eye contact with warhounds and had forgotten, temporarily, that human rank hierarchies had different rules. She looked away. She recalled the remaining hounds from their bowls with a short whistle and a hand signal, and they came, 5 of them moving to her in a loose group with the easy compliance of animals who knew the routine. Bryn came last, as always, because Bryn was the alpha, and the alpha established pace. The king spoke. He asked what the exercise was training. Seren told him. Impulse control, individual discipline, trust in the handler's timeline. He asked why trust in the handler's timeline mattered. Seren told him that a warhound that trusted its handler would wait for the command rather than acting on instinct. That the waiting was not suppression but communication, the animal saying, "I hear you," to the handler, and the handler saying, "The food will come to the animal." That the entire relationship was built on the promise that if the hound was patient, it would be fed. The king was quiet for a moment. He watched Bryn, who had settled at Seren's feet and was watching him back with her pale amber eyes. The warhound and the king regarded each other with the mutual assessment of two apex creatures encountering each other across a boundary. He asked if he could enter the yard. Seren considered this. She had spent 3 weeks building a controlled environment in which the hounds understood every variable. A new person was a new variable, and new variables required management. She told him he could enter if he followed 3 rules. He did not reach for the hounds. He did not make sudden movements. He let them come to him. The king nodded. He climbed the fence rather than walking to the gate, which was faster and which told Seren something about his relationship to protocol that she filed away without comment. He landed inside the yard and stood still, arms at his sides. Seren gave the watch command. 6 warhounds focused their attention on the king. Stone stood. Bryn's ears went forward. Flint, still chewing his meal, stopped chewing. The king stood still. He did not flinch. He did not tense. He stood the way Seren had sat on her first day in the kennel, with the patient stillness of someone who understood that the evaluation was not his to control. Stone approached first. The big gray male crossed the yard with his deliberate, joint-careful walk and sniffed the king's hand, then his boot, then the leather of his belt where the sword usually hung but did not hang today. Stone completed his circuit and returned to Seren's side without reaction, which was the highest endorsement Stone gave. No growl meant acceptable. No tail wag meant not yet trusted. The absence of both meant the evaluation would continue. Bryn did not approach. She remained at Seren's feet and watched. Her decision would take longer than Stone's because her criteria were different. Stone assessed threat. Bryn assessed intent. Seren told the king he could stay in the yard if he liked, but the hounds would need time. She told him this with the same calm, direct tone she used with the animals, because she did not have a different tone for kings, and because she had not been told to develop one. The king stayed. He stayed for an hour, standing at the fence while Seren ran the remaining drills. He watched her work with the focused attention that she recognized from Bryn, the particular quality of observation that was not passive, but active, a mind processing information and building a model of what it was seeing. When she finished, he asked her name. She told him. Seren Lake, Cairn Hollow. He told her his name, which was unnecessary since everyone in the compound knew the king's name, but which he offered anyway. And the offering told her something she had not expected. It told her he understood that an introduction was reciprocal, that names given in one direction without being given in the other created an imbalance, and that imbalances were the beginning of hierarchies that he did not want between himself and the woman who had just shown him something he had not seen in 9 years of ruling this compound. She told him he was welcome in the yard any time, as long as he followed the 3 rules. The king climbed the fence and left. He did not look back. But Seren noticed that his stride was different walking away than it had been walking up, the particular looseness that came from an hour spent watching something that required no decisions and held no consequences, an hour that had been, for a king at war, something close to rest. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Within a week, the king's presence in the training yard had become as much a part of the routine as the feeding schedule and the exercise drills and the particular order in which Seren checked the hound's feet after each session. He arrived at mid-morning, climbed the fence, stood at the rail, and watched. He asked questions, not many, and listened to the answers with the sustained attention that Seren was beginning to understand was his default mode rather than a performance. Connell Breck did not perform attention. He simply paid it, fully and without reservation, the way some people breathed. The hounds adjusted. Stone accepted him on the second visit, allowing the king to stand within arm's reach without reaction. Rust and Needle accepted him on the third. Moss, the quiet dark male, accepted him on the fourth by the simple act of lying down near his feet rather than near Seren's, which was Moss's version of a dramatic declaration. Flint accepted him immediately and completely because Flint was 2 years old and accepted everyone immediately and completely, and Seren had to recall him twice for jumping at the king's legs with the unbridled greeting energy of a 120-pound puppy. Bryn did not accept him. Bryn watched. She sat at Seren's feet and tracked the king's every movement with her amber eyes, and her assessment continued with the unhurried thoroughness of an alpha evaluating a potential addition to the pack dynamic. Seren was not concerned. Bryn's caution was not hostility. It was due diligence, and due diligence, in Seren's experience, produced the most reliable conclusions. On the 8th day of the king's visits, he asked if he could feed the hounds. Seren was measuring meat rations at the cutting block when the question arrived, delivered in the same quiet, direct tone he used for all his questions, as if asking to participate in the feeding of warhounds was no different from asking about exercise schedules or paw care protocols. She set down the knife. She looked at him. She considered. Feeding was the core of the relationship. Feeding was how she had established herself as the central figure in the hound's world, the person who provided, the person whose presence meant sustenance and safety and the continuation of life. Allowing someone else to feed was allowing someone else into the center of that world. It was not a small thing. It was not a favor. It was an invitation into the architecture of trust she had spent weeks constructing, and issuing it to the wrong person could compromise everything. She studied the king, the way she studied the hounds, reading his body for information his words might not provide. His posture at the fence was relaxed, but not careless. His hands rested on the rail, open, the fingers loose. His weight was on both feet evenly, the stance of someone who was grounded rather than ready to move. The scar along his temple was pale in the morning light, and it pulled slightly when his jaw moved, a small imperfection in the otherwise controlled surface of his face that told her the damage was deep enough to have changed the mechanics beneath. She told him he could feed Stone. Only Stone. She told him to hold the bowl at waist height and let Stone approach. She told him not to set the bowl down, because the act of holding the food while the hound ate established the feeder as the source rather than the container, and the distinction mattered. The king took the bowl. He held it exactly as she instructed. Waist height, arms steady, weight balanced. Stone approached with his careful walk, sniffed the bowl, looked at Seren. She gave the release command. Stone ate from the bowl in the king's hands, and the king stood still while a 160-pound warhound consumed raw meat 6 inches from his fingers, and his hands did not shake. Seren watched his hands. She watched the way they held the bowl, firm but not rigid, the grip of someone who understood that the animal could feel tension through the vessel and would interpret tension as threat. His hands were steady. They were also, she noticed, slightly scarred across the knuckles, the kind of working scars that came from years of using a blade and a pen in equal measure. When Stone finished, the king lowered the bowl. He looked at Seren. There was something in his expression that she had not seen during any of his previous visits, something that was not quite a question and not quite a statement, but lived in the territory between them where the most important communications happened. He looked like a man who had just been trusted with something fragile and was trying to understand the weight of it. She told him he did well. She told him with the same tone she used when Flint held his settle for 15 seconds, the same measured approval that communicated not just success, but the particular value of that success within the larger project. The king said nothing. He set the bowl on the cutting block and returned to his position at the fence. Bryn, who had watched the entire feeding from her spot at Seren's feet, stood up. She walked across the yard toward the king. Seren's breath caught, because Bryn had not approached the king in 8 days, and an alpha's first approach was a definitive moment that could not be undone or repeated. Bryn stopped in front of the king. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. 2 apex creatures, separated by species and role, regarding each other across the fundamental question that every first meeting contained. "Are you safe?" Bryn sniffed his hand. She sniffed his wrist. She pressed her nose against the place where his fingers smelled of raw meat and Stone's saliva, the scent of a man who had just participated in the most intimate act in the pack's daily life. She pushed her head against his hand, the same gesture she had given Seren on the first day, the instruction rather than the request. "Pet me, I have decided." The king placed his hand on Bryn's head. He scratched behind her torn ear with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his size and his scar and the war he was conducting from this compound, and Bryn leaned into his hand with the full weight of her broad skull, and the alpha of the king's warhound pack declared, through the simple democracy of contact, that the alpha king of the Western Reach was acceptable. Seren felt something move in her chest. Not her wolf, which was quiet and watchful as always. Something else. Something older than her wolf and more human, a feeling that did not have a name in any language she knew, but that lived in the space between watching a man be gentle with an animal that could kill him and understanding that the gentleness was not for the animal. The king fed Stone every morning after that. Stone first, always, because the sequence Siren had established was law, and the king respected law when the lawgiver had earned the right to make it. He held the bowl at waist height. He stood still. He waited for the release command. And each morning, after Stone finished, the king moved to the fence and stood while Siren completed the feeding. And each morning, Bryn walked to the fence and leaned against his leg, and the king scratched behind her torn ear. And the routine became the routine, as natural and necessary as the drills and the patrols and the nightly solitude in his quarters, where he ate alone. Except now, Siren noticed, he was eating less. She noticed because noticing was what she did, and the king's patterns were as readable to her as the hound's patterns if she paid attention, which she did. He arrived at the yard thinner each week. Not dramatically, not in the way of someone who was starving, but in the incremental way of someone who was not eating enough consistently. The leather of his belt had been tightened by 1 notch, then 2. The bones of his wrists were more visible. The skin beneath his eyes was darker than it should be for a man of 32, the bruised look of sustained undersleep compounded by underfeeding. She asked Marshal Cade, not directly but in the sideways fashion of someone who wanted information without revealing why. She asked whether the officers' rations had been adjusted. Cade said no. She asked whether the king took meals with his council. Cade said no. She asked where the king took his meals. Cade looked at her with his small, shrewd blue eyes, and the ghost of something crossed his face. Not quite concern, and not quite resignation, but the particular expression of a man who had watched a problem develop for years and had been unable to solve it because the problem was a king who did not answer to marshals. He told her the king ate alone. He had eaten alone since the 3rd year of his reign. The meals were prepared and delivered to his quarters and collected later, and the portions that returned were frequently larger than the portions that left. Siren processed this information in the kennel that evening, sitting on the floor with Stone's head on her thigh and Bryn's weight against her knee. She processed it the way she processed everything about the hounds, by fitting the new data into the existing model and looking for the pattern. The pattern was this. A man who ate alone was a man who had removed eating from the social category and placed it in the functional one. Eating was fuel. Eating was maintenance. Eating was something done at a desk between correspondence and cartography. An interruption rather than an event. And a man who treated eating as an interruption would inevitably eat less, because interruptions were things you minimized. She knew this pattern. She had seen it in her father during the seasons when the breeding did not go well and the border contracts did not come. And Owen Lake sat at his workbench repairing equipment instead of eating meals because the work felt more real than the food. She had solved it then by bringing his plate to the workbench and sitting beside him while he ate, because a meal eaten in someone's presence became social again. And social meals were meals that people finished. She could not bring a plate to the king's quarters. She was a kennel handler, an Omega, a Cairn Hollow transplant with 6 warhounds and a pouch of liver treats, and no standing that would justify appearing at the Alpha King's door with dinner. But the king came to her yard every morning. The king held Stone's bowl and stood at her fence and let Bryn lean against his leg. The king had entered her territory, voluntarily, repeatedly, and within her territory, her rules applied. The next morning, Siren prepared 7 portions instead of 6. She prepared them at the cutting block before the king arrived. 6 bowls of raw meat for the hounds and 1 plate of bread and cold meat and a boiled egg from the officer's kitchen that she had requested from the cook's apprentice, with no explanation beyond the statement that she needed it. When the king arrived, she handed him Stone's bowl, as usual. He fed Stone. He returned the bowl. He moved to the fence. Siren picked up the 7th plate. She walked to the fence. She set the plate on the top rail in front of him. The king looked at the plate. He looked at her. She told him he had fed Stone, and now she was feeding him. She told him the principle was the same. If you wanted an animal to eat, you did not leave food in an empty room and hope for the best. You sat with it. You waited. You made the eating an act that happened between 2 creatures rather than in isolation. The silence that followed was longer than any silence Bryn had ever produced during her evaluation of the king, and it carried more weight because the king's silence was not assessment but recognition, the particular recognition of a man who had been seen through a behavior he thought was invisible. He ate the bread. He ate the cold meat. He ate the boiled egg while standing at the fence of a training yard with 6 warhounds and 1 Omega watching him, and he finished every bite because she was sitting with him and waiting and making the eating an act that happened between them rather than alone. When he finished, he set the plate on the rail. He did not thank her. He did not acknowledge what had happened. He looked at her with his gray-green eyes, and the expression on his face was the same one he had worn the first time Stone ate from his hands, the expression of a man who had been trusted with something fragile and was trying to understand the weight of it. He climbed the fence and left. And the next morning, he arrived earlier than usual, and Seren had the 7th plate waiting, and the routine expanded to include the feeding of the king. The feeding became the center of the day, the way the kennel had become the center of the compound's invisible geography, the place where things that could not happen anywhere else happened quietly and without ceremony. Each morning, Seren prepared the 7th plate. Each morning, the king fed Stone, returned the bowl, and ate at the fence while Seren worked the hounds. The meals were simple because the compound's kitchen operated on campaign rations, and Seren was not a cook and did not pretend to be. Bread, cold meat, cheese when the supply allowed it, boiled eggs, dried fruit. She arranged the plate with the same deliberate care she used when measuring the hound's portions, because presentation mattered, even when the presentation was a tin plate on a fence rail, because the act of arranging food for someone was the act of saying, "This was prepared with you in mind," and she wanted him to know. He ate everything. Every morning, he finished every plate, and the portions she gave him were larger than what she ate herself, because she was 5'3" and he was 6'3", and the caloric mathematics of feeding a man his size were not complicated. She watched his belt over the weeks. The notches reversed. The bones of his wrists became less prominent. The shadows under his eyes thinned. She did not comment on any of this. She did not draw attention to the fact that she was feeding the alpha king of the Western Reach from a tin plate at a dog-yard fence every morning, because drawing attention to it would name it, and naming it would change it, and what it was did not need changing. It needed consistency. It needed the same patient, repeated, reliable provision that she gave the hounds, the daily proof that food would come and would continue to come because the person providing it was not going anywhere. The compound adjusted to the new pattern with the particular flexibility of a military community that had learned to accommodate its king's eccentricities without questioning them. The cook's apprentice prepared the extra plate without being asked after the first week, leaving it on the counter with the hound rations as though a plate for the king had always been part of the kennel's requisition. Marshal Cade, who saw everything and commented on nothing, adjusted the morning duty roster so that the training yard was clear during the king's visits, a logistical accommodation that he filed under operational efficiency rather than personal observation. Lord Marin, predictably, noticed and disapproved. He did not raise the issue directly because his previous encounter with Seren at the kennel door had taught him that direct confrontation with the Omega produced results he did not enjoy. Instead, he raised it, tangentially, through the medium of a supply report to the War Council, in which he noted, with careful neutrality, that the kennel's food requisitions had increased by 1 additional meal per day, and that the additional expense, while minor, should be documented for accounting purposes. The report was read at the council meeting. The king was present. Seren was not, but she heard about it from Cade, who told her in his flat, uninflected way that the king had listened to Marin's report, had asked Marin to specify the cost of 1 additional plate of bread and meat per day, and when Marin had provided the figure, the king had asked whether Lord Marin would like to continue discussing the fiscal impact of a boiled egg or whether the council could address the eastern border. Marin did not raise the issue again. The weeks became a month. The month became the rhythm of Seren's life, and the rhythm was this: dawn, feeding of the hounds, preparation of the 7th plate, the king's arrival, the feeding of Stone, the eating at the fence, the morning drills, the afternoon exercises, the evening feeding, the nightly check. Sleep in the kennel on the nights when the hounds were restless, sleep in her quarters on the nights when they were not. And through all of it, the growing awareness that the kennel had become something it was not designed to be, a territory within the compound where rank dissolved and the rules were hers, and the king was not a king, but a man standing at a fence eating bread and watching warhounds. On the 31st day, the routine broke. A border patrol returned with reports of enemy movement along the eastern ridge, and the compound shifted from its sustained readiness into active preparation. Soldiers drilled through the afternoon. The smith's hammer rang past dusk. Officers moved through the compound with the particular urgency of people whose planning was about to become reality. The king was in the war room from dawn until well past midnight, and he did not come to the yard. Seren prepared the 7th plate anyway. She left it on the fence rail, covered with a cloth, and ran the hounds through their morning drills, as usual. The plate was still there at noon. She removed it, ate the bread herself, because waste was something her father had raised her to find intolerable, and prepared a new plate for the following morning. He did not come the 2nd day either, or the 3rd. The compound was in full mobilization. Seren could feel the energy of it in the hounds, who were bred for combat, and whose bodies recognized the shift in the camp's atmosphere the way a storm dog recognized the shift in barometric pressure. Bryn paced. Stone stood at the kennel door and watched the compound with the focused attention of an animal waiting for a command that had not yet come. Flint whined, a low, sustained sound that was not distress, but anticipation. The sound of a young warhound who had been trained for something and had not yet been allowed to do it. On the fourth day, Marshal Cade appeared at the kennel. He told Seren that the king was deploying a combat patrol to the eastern ridge at dawn and that the warhounds had been assigned to the formation. He told her she would need to prepare them for field deployment and hand them to their combat handlers by the 5th hour. Seren's chest tightened. She had known this was coming. The hounds were military animals. They had been bred and trained for combat. Their purpose in the compound was not to lie on straw and eat meat and have their feet checked by a woman from Cairn Hollow. Their purpose was to fight alongside soldiers in formation, to guard flanks and track enemies, and use the bodies they had been built with to do the thing those bodies were designed for. She had known. But knowing and feeling were different territories, and the feeling that rose in her chest when Cade told her to prepare the hounds for combat was the feeling of a woman who had spent 6 weeks building trust with 6 animals and was now being asked to hand that trust to handlers who would use it to put those animals in harm's way. She prepared them. She fed them a heavy meal at dusk because they would need the energy. She checked every paw, every joint, every inch of each hound's body for anything that might compromise their performance. She fit them with the combat harnesses from the equipment store, the heavy leather rigs with the metal studs that she had cleaned and oiled and adjusted to fit each hound's body individually, because a harness that rubbed or pinched or sat wrong would distract a hound in the field, and a distracted hound was a vulnerable one. She spent extra time with Stone. The old gray male stood patiently while she checked his harness, his joints, his teeth. His muzzle was white. His back legs were stiff in the mornings. He was 8 years old, which was old for a warhound, and the stiffness in his joints was not a temporary condition but a progressive one. And Seren knew, with the knowledge that comes from growing up in a kennel where dogs lived and worked and aged and died, that Stone's working days were numbered in months rather than years. She pressed her forehead against his broad skull. She held it there for 10 seconds, breathing in the warm, dusty scent of him, the scent that had become the foundational smell of her life in this compound. She told him to be careful. She told him this in the low voice she used only with the hounds, the voice that was more vibration than word, and Stone leaned into her forehead with the solid pressure of his name. At the 5th hour, the combat handlers arrived. 4 soldiers, experienced, grim-faced, armored. They knew the hounds by their old designations, numbers rather than names, and Seren corrected them once, quietly, and they accepted the correction without comment because they had seen what she had done with these animals, and correction from her carried weight. She handed over the leads, Stone first, Bryn second. The sequence mattered even now, especially now, because the hounds would remember the order, and the order would provide structure in the chaos of whatever was coming. Flint was last. The youngest hound pulled against the lead as the handler took him, looking back at Serene with the wide, confused eyes of an animal who did not understand why the person who fed him was giving him to someone else. Seren held her expression steady. She gave the watch command, and Flint focused forward, and the handlers led the hounds to the formation staging area, and Serene stood in the empty kennel with 6 empty stalls and 6 empty bowls and a 7th plate on the fence rail that no one had come to eat. She cleaned the kennel because the kennel needed cleaning, and because cleaning was the thing her hands knew how to do when the rest of her did not know how to be still. She scrubbed the floors, she changed the straw, she organized the supply shelf. She did everything there was to do, and then she sat on the floor where Stone usually lay and waited. The patrol departed at dawn. Serene watched from the east wall, standing at the parapet where the king usually stood to watch her. The column moved east through the tree line, soldiers in formation with the hounds at the flanks, massive shapes moving through the gray morning with the purposeful gait of animals doing what they had been built to do. She saw Stone's gray bulk at the rear flank. She saw Bryn at the front, ears forward, leading. She saw Flint in the middle, keeping pace, no longer looking back. She saw the king at the head of the column, mounted, straight-backed, his dark hair visible above the armor's collar. He did not look back either. Seren stood on the wall until the column disappeared into the forest. Then she went back to the empty kennel and sat on the floor and waited for them to come home. They were gone for 6 days. Seren counted them the way she counted breaths when sitting with a new animal, steadily and without allowing the counting to become anxiety. She maintained the kennel routine in their absence, cleaning stalls that did not need cleaning, filling water troughs that did not need filling, preparing meals that had no mouths to receive them. She ate the 7th plate herself each morning, sitting at the fence in the spot where the king usually stood, eating bread and cold meat and staring at the tree line to the east as though sustained attention could pull the column home faster. On the fourth day, she walked to the supply stores and found the cook's apprentice and asked whether there was news from the patrol. The apprentice, a nervous beta boy named Hale, who had developed a fondness for Seren based entirely on her willingness to answer his questions about the hounds, told her that a runner had come in the previous night with a report. Contact with the enemy at the ridge, engagement sustained, casualties unknown. The patrol was holding position, casualties unknown. The word sat in Seren's chest like a stone that she could not swallow and could not spit out. Casualties could mean soldiers, casualties could mean the king, casualties could mean the hounds. The word did not distinguish between the species it consumed. She went back to the kennel. She sat on the floor. She placed her hands on her knees the way she had on the first day, the position of patience and stillness and the deliberate choice to trust the process. And she sat and waited because waiting was the only skill she had that applied to this situation. On the 6th day, at the 10th hour of the morning, the column came through the tree line. Seren was on the east wall. She saw them emerge from the forest in a loose formation, slower than they had departed, the pace of a unit that had been fighting and was now walking home on the particular fuel of relief and exhaustion that came after sustained engagement. She counted the shapes. She counted the soldiers. She counted the hounds. 5 hounds. Her hands gripped the parapet stone. 5. She counted again because counting was the thing she did, and because 6 minus 1 was a mathematics she was not willing to accept without verification. She counted a third time, tracking each shape, identifying each animal by size and gait and the particular way they moved within the formation. Stone was not there. Serene descended the wall. She walked through the compound to the main gate. She walked with the controlled pace of someone who is moving through an emergency by refusing to acknowledge that the emergency was happening because acknowledging it would require her to feel it, and feeling it would stop her from moving. The column entered the compound through the main gate. Soldiers peeled off toward the barracks, some walking under their own power, others supported by comrades. The hounds came through with their handlers, and Seren was there, and the handlers released the leads without being asked because the leads were a formality now, and everyone in the compound knew it. Bryn came to her first. The alpha female was thinner than she had been 6 days ago, her coat matted and dirty, her torn ear crusted with something dark that Serene did not want to name. Bryn pressed against Serene's legs with the full weight of her body. Not the composed lean of the training yard, but the desperate press of an animal seeking the only safety it trusted. Rust came next, limping worse than usual, his bad leg taking almost no weight. Then Needle, then Moss, then Flint. They crowded around her, 5 hounds pressing into the space that 6 had occupied, and the absence of the 6th was a physical thing, a gap in the formation of bodies that Seren could feel the way you feel a missing tooth, by the emptiness where the pressure used to be. She looked at the handlers. She asked where Stone was. The lead handler, a career soldier with the flat expression of a man who had delivered bad news before, told her that the gray male had gone down during the engagement on the 4th day. He told her that the hound had been guarding the rear flank when the enemy pushed through. He told her that Stone had held the position long enough for the soldiers behind him to regroup and that the enemy had not gotten past him. He told her that the hound was still alive. He told her that Stone was on the supply wagon at the rear of the column because the gray male could not walk but was still breathing, and the king had ordered the wagon cleared to make space for him. Serene left the 5 hounds with Flint's handler and ran. She ran through the compound to the rear gate where the supply wagons were rolling in, heavy wheels grinding through the mud, and she found the last wagon and she found Stone. He was lying on a bed of folded blankets in the wagon bed. He was alive. His breathing was shallow and labored, his great gray sides rising and falling with the particular effort of a body that was working harder than it should to accomplish the basic function of staying alive. His right flank showed a long, dark mark that she could see even in the shadow of the wagon canopy, and his back legs were positioned at an angle that told her something had been damaged in the structure that held him upright. She climbed into the wagon. She knelt beside him. She placed her hand on his head and he opened his eyes, those dark brown eyes that had been the first to trust her, and his tail moved. Once. A single heavy thump against the blanket that cost him visible effort, and that said, in the only language he had, "You are here." Serene pressed her forehead against his skull. She breathed in the dusty, warm scent of him, changed now, overlaid with copper and dirt and the particular sharpness of an animal in pain. She held the position and breathed and did not cry because crying would change the vibration of her body against his. And Stone was reading her body the way he had always read her body. And what he needed to read right now was calm. The king appeared at the wagon's tailgate. She did not hear him approach. She only became aware of his presence when Stone's tail thumped again, weakly, and she looked up and he was standing there. He was still in his armor, dirty and dented and streaked with the dark residue of 6 days in the field. His face was drawn with the fatigue of sustained combat and the particular weight of command during a fight that had cost him people. The scar along his temple was livid against the paleness of exhaustion. He told her he had put Stone on the wagon himself. He told her the hound had gone down fighting and that he had gone to the rear flank when the handlers reported the hound was still alive and that he had carried Stone to the wagon. He said this simply, without emphasis, the way he reported operational details. But the state of his armor told a different story because carrying a 160-pound warhound across a battlefield while wearing plate armor was not an operational detail. It was an act that no one would have questioned him for not doing, an act that cost something specific that he had chosen to spend. Seren looked at the king. She looked at him standing at the tailgate of a supply wagon with battle grime on his armor and the fatigue of 6 days in his face and the knowledge of what he had done for her dog in his eyes, and the wall she had been maintaining between the kennel and everything outside it, the careful wall of routine and discipline and the deliberate refusal to name whatever was happening between them, developed a fracture that ran from top to bottom and would not close. She asked if she could take Stone to the kennel. The king told her to take whatever she needed from the supply stores. He told Cade to ensure the kennel had anything the hound required. He said this to Cade, who had appeared beside the wagon with the reliable ubiquity of a man whose job was to be wherever the king needed him to be. Then the king did something that no one in the compound had seen him do. He climbed into the wagon. He lifted Stone, all 160 pounds of the old gray male, gathering the hound against his armored chest with the careful strength of a man who understood that the creature he was holding was both heavy and breakable. Stone hung in his arms, legs dangling, head resting against the king's shoulder in a position of absolute trust that Seren had never seen from any animal toward any person except herself. The king carried Stone through the compound. He carried him past the barracks and the mess hall and the smith's forge and the officers' quarters. He carried him past soldiers who stopped and stared and past Lord Marin, who stopped and stared with a different quality of confusion. He carried him to the kennel door, where Seren had run ahead and prepared a nest of clean straw and fresh blankets, and he lowered Stone into the bedding with a gentleness that belied the armor and the size and the war that was still echoing through his body. Stone settled into the blankets, his tail thumped once more, his dark eyes moved from Seren to the king, and back to Seren, and the old hound closed his eyes. The king straightened. He stood in the kennel he had never entered, surrounded by 5 hounds who had come home and one who had almost not, and he looked at Seren, kneeling beside Stone, with her hand on the old dog's head and her expression holding the same controlled calm she had shown every day since the first day she walked into this kennel and sat on the floor and waited. He told her he was sorry. He said it quietly with the rough-edged voice of a man who did not say sorry often and who meant it fully when he did. He was sorry that the hound had been hurt. He was sorry that the purpose of the hounds was violence and that violence had consequences. He was sorry that the things she cared for were the things he used as weapons, and that the contradiction between her care and his use was a contradiction he could not resolve. Seren looked up at him. She told him that the contradiction was not between care and use. It was between people who saw the hounds as tools and people who saw them as living things. She told him that she had watched him carry Stone through the compound, and that a man who carried a war hound in his arms through an entire military installation was not a man who saw the hound as a tool. She told him he could sit down if he wanted. The king looked at the kennel floor. He looked at the straw and the blankets and the 5 hounds who were arranged around Stone in the tight protective formation of a pack surrounding a member who was hurt. He looked at the space between Seren and the wall where a person could sit. He sat. He lowered himself to the floor in his armor, campaign leather and plate and all, and he sat in the straw beside the Omega and the hounds, and Bryn immediately pressed against his leg, and Flint put his head on the king's boot, and the king sat in the kennel and did not leave. Seren reached for the plate she had prepared that morning, the 7th plate, the one she had been eating herself for 6 days, the one that had been waiting at the fence rail every morning for a man who was not there. She held it out to him. The king took it. He ate, sitting on a kennel floor in dirty armor surrounded by warhounds, while an Omega sat beside him with her hand on an old dog's head. He ate everything on the plate. He ate the way a hungry man eats when someone is watching, and the watching is not judgment but presence, and the presence makes the food taste like more than fuel. When he finished, Seren took the plate. She set it aside. She did not look at him, and he did not look at her, and neither of them spoke. And they sat in the straw, and the silence and the kennel's warm, close air, while Stone breathed, and the pack settled, and the war outside the building continued without them. Stone healed. Not completely and not quickly and not in the way that young animals healed, with the elastic bounce of bodies that had not yet learned their limits. He healed the way old animals healed, slowly and structurally, the body rebuilding itself with the deliberate, grudging effort of something that knew the cost and was willing to pay it one more time. Seren tended him the way her father had tended the senior tracking hounds in Cairn Hollow, with patience and consistency and the particular attention to detail that old animals required because they could not compensate for deficiencies the way young ones could. She changed his bedding twice a day. She adjusted his diet to support the healing, reducing the raw meat and adding bone broth that she made herself, boiling down scraps from the kitchen in a pot she kept on the kennel's small hearth. She worked his joints through passive range of motion exercises every morning and evening, gently flexing and extending his hind legs to prevent the stiffness from calcifying into permanence. Stone tolerated the ministrations with the patient acceptance of an old dog who had been through enough to know when someone was helping. His tail thumped when she arrived each morning. His dark eyes followed her around the kennel. He ate the broth. He allowed the exercises. And each day he was slightly stronger than the day before, the improvement measured in millimeters and ounces of weight borne on the healing leg, but improvement nonetheless, and Seren tracked it with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that healing was not an event, but an accumulation. The king came to the kennel every day now, not to the training yard, to the kennel itself, the stone and timber building where the hounds lived and where Stone was recovering, and where Seren spent the majority of her hours. He came after his morning war council, which was earlier now that the border situation was active, and he sat on the floor beside Stone's bed and helped. He held Stone's foreleg while Seren worked the hind joints. He carried water buckets from the well. He cleaned stalls. He did these things in his campaign leathers, without comment, without the suggestion that any task was beneath his rank. And Seren let him because turning away someone who wanted to help was a waste of willing hands, and because watching the alpha king of the Western Reach muck out a warhound's stall was something she was not prepared to surrender. Marshal Cade appeared at the kennel one afternoon while the king was on the floor helping Seren change Stone's bandages. Cade stood in the doorway and watched for a moment, his blue eyes taking in the scene with the comprehensive assessment of a man who processed information the way other people breathed. The king looked up, said nothing, and continued helping. Cade nodded once, said he would return, and left. Lord Merrin appeared at the kennel the following day. He stood in the doorway and watched for a considerably shorter moment before his pale face arranged itself into the expression of a man who was composing a report in his head even as the situation unfolded before him. Seren watched him watch the king sitting on a kennel floor, and she watched him calculate the political implications of the Alpha King spending his mornings with an Omega and her dogs, and she watched him decide that the implications were someone else's problem. Merrin left. The report, if he wrote one, was never filed. Seren suspected that even Marin's particular brand of administrative zealotry had limits, and those limits included telling the king that the fiscal impact of sitting on a kennel floor was a matter for the War Council. The weeks passed. Stone improved. The border situation stabilized. The compound settled back into its rhythm of sustained readiness, the particular operational hum of a military installation that existed in the space between peace and war and had forgotten what either one felt like in its pure form. The king ate at the kennel now, not at the fence rail, not standing, not in the transactional posture of a man receiving fuel. He sat on the floor with Serene and the hounds and ate from the same type of plate she ate from, and the eating was slow and social and accompanied by the quiet sounds of a kennel in the morning, the hounds chewing, the straw rustling, the particular companionable silence of two people who had built a shared life out of routine and proximity and the mutual understanding that neither of them needed to explain what they were doing because they were doing it together, and that was sufficient explanation. He told her things, not in monologues, not in confessions, but in the small pieces that accumulated over mornings the way Stone's healing accumulated over days. He told her about the maps he drew, the way the landscape of his kingdom existed in his head as a series of lines and elevations and tactical considerations that he could not turn off even when he looked at a hillside and wanted to see only a hillside. He told her about his father, in fragments, the way someone mentions a storm that happened years ago, with respect for the damage and distance from the feeling. He told her about eating alone, about the years of it, about the way solitude had hardened around his evenings like ice around a stone, until the stone forgot it was a stone and thought it was the ice. He told her that the seventh plate had changed something. He said this on a morning when Stone stood up on his own for the first time since the patrol, The old gray dog rising from his bedding with visible effort and standing on all four legs and looking at Seren with the particular expression of an animal, proving something to someone it loved. The king watched Stone stand and said that the plate had been the first thing in years that was given to him without being requested and without carrying an obligation. That it was food, which was the simplest thing in the world, and that the simplicity was what had reached him because everything else in his life was complicated, and the plate was not complicated. The plate was bread and cold meat, and the fact that someone had prepared it, knowing he would come. Seren listened. She listened the way she had learned to listen to the hounds, with her whole body, receiving the information without interpreting it, letting the meaning arrive in its own time, rather than reaching for it. She told him about Cairn Hollow. She told him about her father's kennel, the tracking hounds with their long ears and patient eyes, the way the morning feeding had been the architecture of her childhood, the sound of dogs eating in the dawn light. She told him about the day the border consolidation came, and her village was absorbed into the kingdom, and her life was rewritten in the language of military assignments and compound protocols, and a word she had never needed before, refugee. She told him that the hounds had saved her. Not metaphorically, actually saved her. That when she walked into the kennel and sat on the floor and Stone put his head on her thigh, she had felt, for the first time in 3 years, like a person with a purpose rather than a line item on a relocation ledger. The king listened. He listened with the sustained attention that she now understood was not performance but offering, the gift of a mind that could hold a campaign's worth of strategic detail, choosing to hold, instead, the words of a woman sitting on a kennel floor. He told her she was not a line item. He said it the way he said everything, directly, without ornament, in the voice that commanders used for orders and that he was using for something else entirely. Stone put his head on the king's thigh. It was the first time Stone had rested his head on anyone other than Seren since his injury, and the gesture carried the weight of a declaration in the hound's language. Seren watched the king's hand move to Stone's head, watched the long, scarred fingers scratch behind the old dog's ear, watched the gray tail thump against the straw, and she felt the fracture in her wall widen into something that was no longer a fracture, but a door. That evening, for the first time in 9 years, the king did not eat in his quarters. He came to the kennel at dusk. Serene was preparing the evening feeding, measuring portions at the cutting block, moving through the routine with the automated precision of hands that had done this work so many times that the work had become an extension of the body rather than a task performed by it. She heard him climb the yard fence and cross to the kennel door and stand in the entrance, and she did not look up because she did not need to. She knew his footsteps the way she knew Stone's breathing, by sound and weight and the particular rhythm of a body she had been paying attention to for weeks. She prepared 8 portions, 6 for the hounds, 1 for him, 1 for herself. She fed the hounds in their sequence: Stone, Bryn, Rust, Needle, Moss, Flint. The king watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms folded, the posture he had used at the training yard fence on those first mornings, the posture of a man observing a world he wanted to enter, but had not yet been invited into far enough. When the hounds were fed, Seren carried 2 plates to the spot on the floor where Stone had returned to his bedding. She sat. She placed 1 plate beside her. She held the other out to the king. He crossed the kennel. He sat beside her. He took the plate. They ate together. On the kennel floor, in the warm amber light of the small hearth, surrounded by 6 warhounds who were eating and settling and arranging themselves in the nightly constellation of bodies that meant safety. They ate the same food from the same plates, and the eating was not feeding, and it was not fueling, and it was not the 7th plate on the fence rail. It was a meal, shared, chosen, the deliberate act of 2 people eating together because they wanted to, because the compound had a mess hall and the king had quarters, and neither of those places was this place, and this place was where they both wanted to be. When they finished, Seren took the plates. She stacked them on the cutting block. She returned to the floor because Stone needed his evening exercises, and the routine did not pause for meals or feelings or the presence of a king who had just eaten dinner on her kennel floor. She was reaching for Stone's hind leg when the king's hand covered hers. The touch was light. His fingers were warm and rough with calluses, and they rested on the back of her hand with the careful weight of someone who understood that touch was a language and that the first word in that language should be spoken softly. Seren held still. She held still the way she had on the first day in the kennel with the patient attention of someone letting an evaluation happen. Except this time, she was the one being approached. And the creature approaching was not a warhound, but a king who had spent 9 years in the ice of his own solitude. and was now sitting on a kennel floor with his hand on hers, asking, through the contact of skin on skin, whether this was permitted. She turned her hand over. She laced her fingers through his. She held on. The king's breath caught. A small sound, barely audible above the hound's breathing and the hearth's crackling. But Serene heard it because she was listening for it the way she listened for everything, with her whole body, with the trained attention of a woman who had spent her life reading creatures that could not speak and translating their silence into meaning. She held his hand. He held hers. Stone's head was on the king's thigh, and Bryn was pressed against Seren's knee, and the other hounds were settled in their places, and the kennel was warm and close and alive with the breathing of 8 creatures who had chosen to be here, and the choosing was the thing that mattered, because everything else in their lives was assigned and ordered and requisitioned. But this sitting on a floor and holding hands and being held, this was chosen. Seren looked at the king. The scar along his temple was soft in the hearthlight. His gray-green eyes were not bright or direct or unnervingly focused. They were open. They were showing her the thing behind the fortress, the thing behind the solitude and the strategy, and the 9 years of eating alone. They were showing her a man who was hungry, who had been hungry for a long time, and who had finally let someone close enough to feed him. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He lowered his chin to her hair. The hounds breathed. The fire crackled. The compound hummed outside the kennel walls with the machinery of war and logistics and the particular energy of a military installation preparing for tomorrow. Inside the kennel, tomorrow was not a concern. Inside the kennel, the only concern was this. The hounds were fed. The king was fed. The woman who fed them all was sitting beside the man she had been feeding, and his hand was in hers, and she was not letting go. She was not letting go. Outside, in the compound's central lane, Marshal Joran Cade walked past the kennel on his evening rounds. He glanced at the closed door. He heard the quiet sounds from within, the dogs, the fire, the particular silence of 2 people who were not talking because they did not need to. The ghost of something crossed his weathered face. Not quite satisfaction, not quite relief. The expression of a man who had watched a problem for years and was seeing it, finally, resolve itself in a way he could not have predicted and would not have dared to arrange. He walked on. He did not mention it in his morning report. Some things did not require documentation. Some things simply required being allowed to happen.